I'm Randall Holcombe. We're talking about some basic ideas of public choice. And in this segment, I want to think about the role of democratic decision-making in creating a prosperous society. Now, a couple of key elements that you have to create a prosperous society is protection of property rights and rule of law. Without those elements, people don't have an incentive to be productive because it's too easy for their productivity, anything that they produce, to be taken away from them by others. So really one of the key elements in a prosperous society is protection of property rights and rule of law. Now, we tend to think very highly of the idea of democratic government, but there are a couple of ways that we can look at democratic government. One is that democracy is a method through which we can peacefully replace the people who hold the power of government. We can go through democratic elections rather than having revolutions and coups and violent overthrows of government. And in that sense, democracy is a great mechanism for trying to ensure a prosperous society. But there's a second way that we tend to think about democracy, and it's becoming increasingly common. That too often we think about democracy as a type of government that carries out the will of the people, that carries out the will of the majority. And somehow through democratic elections, we hold elections, we find out what the public interest is, and then democratic government carries out the will of the people as determined through democratic elections. The problem with that view is that if that's really the way we're viewing democracy, that democratic governments carry out the will of the majority, it's too easy for democratic governments to undermine protection of property rights and rule of law. If somehow the democratic government thinks, well, we ought to compromise property rights in some way, or some people should be advantaged over others, that ideology of democracy, the ideology that says democratic government carries out the will of the people, lends itself toward us thinking if the government wants to compromise property rights, if the government wants to compromise rule of law, then it becomes too easy for a democratic government to do that. And we end up compromising the institutions that lead to a prosperous society. Now, if we look at my country, the United States, that's been pretty successful over several decades, there might be a tendency to look at the democratic United States government and say democracy has done a pretty good job of ensuring prosperity. But actually, if you look at the United States government, you think about the role of government in ensuring prosperity, it's not so much that the government is democratic, but rather that it was designed with constitutionally limited powers. And it's constitutional limits on government that ensure a free and prosperous society much more than democracy. The United States Constitution was set up to design a government with limited and enumerated powers. The Constitution says these are the powers of government, and the government cannot exercise any powers beyond those limited and enumerated powers. It's the constitutional constraints that ensure that government protects property rights, ensure that government enforces rule of law that leads to a prosperous society. The constitutional constraints, not the fact that we have a democratic government. But even in the United States, and this is true around the world, that ideology of democracy has increasingly been creeping in. So that ideologically, rather than thinking about a limited government with constitutional constraints, we're thinking about a democratic government that carries out the will of the people. And so then, when the government acts to undertake policies which might compromise rule of law, which might compromise private property rights, the ideology of democracy causes us to think that's the will of the majority, that's the will of the people, that's what democratic government is enabled to do, that's what we want a democracy to do. That ideology of democracy is dangerous in the sense that it's threatening to undermine the very foundations of prosperity in our society. The ideology of democracy that tells us whatever democratic government does, it's carrying out the will of the majority, compromises property rights, compromises rule of law, and undermines the institutions of prosperity. So we need to think carefully when we think about democratic decision making. Democracy is a great method for deciding who holds the power of government, but it's not a very good method for deciding what those powers are. In order to decide what those powers are, we need a constitutionally limited government with constitutional constraints that enforce the government's protection of property rights, that create a rule of law, not a democratic government that is supposed to carry out the will of the majority. That undermines the very institutions that create prosperity.